If you have ever been judged before anyone bothered to know your name, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what happens on this doorstep is going to change the way you see every uniform, every knock, and every assumption you have ever made about a tired man raising a little girl alone. Before we begin, if stories like this move you, hit like and subscribe, because there is so much more truth waiting for you on this channel. Marcus Bennett had exactly 11 minutes to get his daughter ready for school, and he was losing. Sophie socks, both feet. I mean it this time. He said it the way he said most things at 6:40 in the morning. Half command, half plea, entirely exhausted. Sophie, 7 years old and utterly unbothered by the concept of urgency, was lying upside down on the living room couch with one sock dangling from her big toe like a flag of surrender. "Daddy, do you think Mrs. Alvarez would let me bring waffles for show and tell?" Waffles is a goldfish, baby. Goldfish don't do well outside their bowl. But he could wear a little raincoat. Marcus closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, the way a man does when he needs to remember that this chaos, this insanity, this small glowing person upside down on his couch was the whole reason he still got out of bed every morning. 2 years ago, there had been another set of hands to catch these mornings when they fell apart. 2 years ago, Elena would have already had Sophie dressed, fed, and halfway out the door with her backpack zipped, humming some song from the radio while Marcus tried to find his other shoe. 2 years ago, this house had 2 adults in it instead of one man learning, every single day, how to be enough. He didn't let himself think about the hospital room very often anymore. He'd trained himself not to. But some mornings, in the particular slant of light through the kitchen window, or in the exact way Sophie tilted her head when she was concentrating, he saw her mother so clearly it nearly buckled his knees. Grief didn't leave. It just learned to sit quietly in the passenger seat while he drove. "Socks," he said again. "Gentler this time, then teeth, then shoes. We are a well-oiled machine, remember?" "We're a machine that's always late," Sophie said. But she swung her legs down off the couch and started tugging the sock over her heel. Marcus Bennett did not look like what most people pictured when they heard the words federal prosecutor. He wore a faded gray hoodie most mornings, jeans with a hole starting at the left knee, and a 2-day beard he hadn't found time to shave. His badge, if you could call it that. His Department of Justice credentials, the ones that named him an assistant United States attorney for the district, lived in the inside pocket of the suit jacket hanging by the door, waiting for the version of him that would exist again in about 90 minutes, after carpool, after coffee, after he'd transformed himself back into the man who stood in federal courtrooms and told juries the truth about dangerous people. At home in this narrow 2-story house on Larkspur Street with its crooked mailbox and its overgrown hydrangea bush he kept meaning to trim, he was just dad. And some days, that was the harder job. The knock came at 6:52 a.m. It was not a friendly knock. Marcus knew the difference between a neighbor's knuckles and this. 3 sharp raps, deliberate, official. The kind of knock that expected to be answered immediately. He glanced at Sophie, who had frozen mid-shoelace with the particular stillness children get when they sense adult tension before they understand its source. "Stay here, baby." He opened the door in his hoodie and sock feet and found himself looking at a Beltree police officer standing on his porch, one hand resting near his belt, sunglasses pushed up on his forehead despite the early hour, as if he'd wanted his eyes visible for this. Behind him, a police cruiser sat at an angle against the curb, lights off but engine running. "Morning," Marcus said, already reading the situation the way 15 years of courtroom instinct had trained him to. Something was wrong here, and it wasn't about him yet. It was about what the officer had decided about him before the door even opened. "Sir, I need to see some identification." Marcus blinked. "Can I ask what this is regarding, officer?" He glanced at the name tag. "Officer Dunham?" "There's been a report of a possible break-in on this street. Suspicious male matching your description seen entering this residence early this morning. Marcus almost laughed, except nothing about the officer's posture suggested this was a moment for laughing. This is my house. I've lived here 6 years. I understand that's what you're telling me, sir. I still need to see ID. Behind him, Marcus heard Sophie's sneakers pad softly across the hardwood floor, and he threw out an arm without turning. A silent signal. Stay back, baby, let Daddy handle this. The same gesture he'd have used to keep her from stepping into traffic. My daughter's getting ready for school, Marcus said, keeping his voice level. The same even, unhurried tone he used when a hostile witness was trying to bait him in front of a jury. I don't have my wallet on me right now. It's upstairs. I can go get it. I'd prefer you stay right where I can see you. Then I can't get my ID, can I? A muscle worked in Dunham's jaw. Sir, I'm going to need you to step outside. Why exactly am I stepping outside of my own home, officer? Because I asked you to. There was something underneath the exchange that had nothing to do with break-ins or reports or suspicious mails, and Marcus understood it the way he understood a courtroom the second a case turned personal. This wasn't about a call. This was about a black man in a hoodie answering a door on a street where, Marcus would later learn, someone 2 doors down had simply decided he didn't belong there. The report would turn out to be 4 words texted to a neighborhood watch group. New guy, looks off. 6 years. 6 years of trimming that hydrangea, of waving to Mrs. Petrosky when she walked her beagle, of hosting the block's 4th of July barbecue 2 summers running because Elena had loved doing it and he'd kept the tradition alive because stopping felt like losing her twice. 6 years, and somehow he was still new guy, looks off to somebody on this street. Daddy? Sophie's voice, small and frightened, cut through everything. She was standing in the hallway now despite his signal, her backpack half on one shoulder, staring at the officer with the wide, uncomprehending eyes of a child watching the safest person in her world be treated like a threat. Something in Marcus's chest cracked open. Not fear for himself, he'd stopped being afraid for himself a long time ago. Somewhere in 100 courtrooms full of men who wanted him dead for prosecuting them. But a raw, protective fury on Sophie's behalf. She should never have to see her father questioned on his own threshold like a criminal. She should never learn, at 7 years old, that a badge could walk up to your door and decide, before a single word was exchanged, that you were guilty of existing. It's okay, baby, Marcus said, though his voice had gone tight. Go back inside and finish your shoes. I'll be right there. Sir, step outside, Dunham said again, his hand shifting slightly. Not to his weapon, but close enough that Marcus registered the movement and filed it away with the precision of a man who would, if this went wrong, need to remember every detail for a deposition. Marcus stepped onto the porch, pulling the door mostly closed behind him, leaving it open a crack so he could hear Sophie, so she could hear him. So neither of them was cut off from the other in whatever came next. Officer Dunham, he said quietly, I am going to tell you something. And I need you to actually hear it before this goes any further. My name is Marcus Bennett. I am an assistant United States attorney for this district. My credentials are in my jacket pocket, hanging on a hook 8 feet behind that door. I am also a single father, and my daughter is inside and she is scared, and I would like this conversation to end before it scares her any more than it already has. For a moment, nothing in Dunham's expression changed. Marcus had seen this before too. The particular stubbornness of a man who has already decided how a story ends and doesn't want new facts complicating the narrative. Some people, badge or not, simply did not know how to hear correction gracefully. I'm going to need to verify that, Dunham said finally. Then verify it. But you're not stepping into my house, and you're not detaining me on my own porch while my 7-year-old watches over a text message from someone who apparently doesn't recognize their own neighbor. It was at that exact moment that a second car pulled up, not a cruiser, but an unmarked sedan, and out of it stepped a woman Marcus recognized instantly, Captain Renata Ford, head of the Beltree PD's Community Relations Division, a woman he had worked alongside on 2 federal task forces involving trafficking cases in the district. She'd clearly been alerted, or perhaps she simply happened to be driving through. The details of that particular stroke of fortune would come out later, but her arrival changed the temperature of the entire porch in an instant. "Marcus?" Captain Ford's eyebrows lifted in genuine surprise as she came up the walk. "What in the world is going on here?" "Ask Officer Dunham," Marcus said evenly. "He seems to think I broke into my own house." Captain Ford's face did something complicated: surprise, then dawning understanding, then a controlled professional anger that Marcus recognized because he wore that same expression in court sometimes, right before he dismantled an opposing argument piece by piece. "Officer Dunham, do you know who this is?" "I was told there was a possible break-in, Captain. I was following protocol." "This is Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Bennett. He and I worked the Halverson trafficking case together 18 months ago. He put away 4 men who are never seeing daylight again because of the work he did in that courtroom." Her voice had dropped into something low and precise. "Did you run the address before you knocked?" "The call came in as a possible break-in, ma'am. I responded to." "Did you run the address?" The silence that followed answered the question more completely than any words could have. It would come out, over the following days, in the kind of detail that only an internal investigation produces, that the report had originated from a neighbor 3 houses down, a man named Colton Hargrove, new to the street himself, who had seen Marcus coming home late one night in his work clothes and made an assumption he never bothered to verify. He hadn't called about a specific incident. He'd simply decided, watching a black man let himself into a house with a key, that something didn't look right, and texted the neighborhood group instead of introducing himself like a decent human being would have a year and a half earlier, when Marcus first moved in with a pregnant wife and a U-Haul full of second-hand furniture. Dispatch had flagged it as a possible break-in without verification. Dunham had responded without checking property records, without confirming resident information, without doing the single most basic piece of due diligence that would have told him, in about 90 seconds, that Marcus Bennett had owned that house since before Sophie was born. Captain Ford turned to Marcus, her expression softening into something almost apologetic, though the anger hadn't left her eyes. "Marcus, I am so sorry. This should never have happened, and it's going to be reviewed all the way up. Are you all right? Is Sophie all right?" Behind him, the door creaked further open, and Sophie's face appeared in the gap, tear-streaked, backpack still hanging off one shoulder. Marcus knelt down immediately, all the courtroom composure falling away, and pulled her into his arms right there on the porch. Hey, it's okay. Daddy's okay. Everybody's okay." "Why did the policeman think you did something bad?" Sophie asked into his shoulder, her voice muffled and small. It was, Marcus would think later, one of the hardest questions anyone had ever asked him in a career built on hard questions. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that sometimes people decide who you are before they know anything true about you? How do you explain that her father, a man who had spent his entire adult life inside the machinery of justice, trying to make it work the way it was supposed to work, had just stood on his own porch and felt what it was like to be presumed guilty by the very system he served? "Sometimes," Marcus said slowly, choosing each word the way he chose words for a jury, "people make mistakes because they don't stop to ask questions first. The policeman made a mistake. He's going to learn from it. And Daddy is completely fine and completely safe, and so are you. Are you sure? I have never been more sure of anything in my life. What Marcus didn't say to Sophie, because it wasn't a 7-year-old's burden to carry, was the deeper ache underneath the anger. The loneliness of parenting through moments like this without a partner beside him to lean into afterward, to process it with over a late dinner once Sophie was asleep, to say out loud, "That scared the hell out of me," and hear someone say back, "I know, I saw your face." Elena would have known exactly what to say to their daughter in that moment. Elena would have known exactly what Marcus needed too. He had learned in 2 years of solo parenting to be both people at once, the strong one and the one who needed strength. And some days the seams of that arrangement showed more than others. He picked Sophie up, 7 years old and getting heavier every month, and carried her back inside to finish getting ready, while Captain Ford stayed on the porch with Officer Dunham, her voice dropping into the low, clipped cadence of a superior who intended to make her displeasure a matter of permanent record. The story might have ended there, quietly with an internal memo and a training requirement, and Marcus simply going back to being a tired single dad trying to get a 7-year-old to school on time. But Beltree was a small enough town, and Mrs. Petrosky across the street had been watching the whole thing unfold from behind her curtains with her phone in hand. And by that evening, video of Officer Dunham demanding identification from a man on his own porch, his daughter visible and crying in the doorway behind him, had made its way onto 3 different neighborhood social media pages. Marcus hadn't wanted that. He wasn't a man who sought attention. His entire professional life was built on quiet, methodical work, building cases brick by brick until the truth was undeniable, and he preferred it that way. But the video spread faster than he could have stopped it, and within 2 days a local news producer was calling his office asking for comment. And within a week the story had a headline, "Federal prosecutor detained on his own porch while daughter watches. Beltree PD launches internal review." He almost declined every interview request. His instinct, honed by years of keeping his personal life separate from his professional one, was to let it fade, to trust the internal review process, to protect Sophie from any more exposure than she'd already had. But something Captain Ford said to him during a follow-up call stayed with him. "Marcus, you have a platform most people in this situation don't have. You could let this disappear into a filing cabinet, or you could use it to make sure this doesn't happen to somebody else who doesn't have a federal badge to fall back on. Somebody who really would have been arrested that morning. Somebody whose daughter really would have watched her father get put in the back of a cruiser." That was the thought that changed his mind, because Marcus knew, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent his career inside the justice system's failures and successes both, that his outcome that morning had been shaped by privilege he almost never got to claim, the privilege of a title that made a captain turn her unmarked car around. Somewhere in this same city, on this same kind of morning, a man without that title had been handcuffed for less, had been shot for less. The system that finally worked for Marcus Bennett on his own porch did not reliably work for men who looked exactly like him but carried a different job title, or no job title at all, or simply the wrong zip code on a bad day. So he agreed to one interview, on the condition that Sophie's face never appear on camera, and he sat in his gray hoodie, the same one from that morning, worn deliberately, a quiet refusal to perform respectability for people who hadn't extended him basic respect in the first place. And he told the truth plainly, without theatrics. "I am not interested in Officer Dunham losing his job," he said, when the interviewer pushed him toward outrage. "I'm interested in every officer in this department understanding that a knock on a door is not a small thing. It doesn't just interrupt a morning. It can rewrite what a child believes about safety for the rest of her life. My daughter asked me that morning why the policeman thought I did something bad. I don't ever want another child asking her father that question because somebody decided not to check an address before knocking." The interview did what interviews sometimes do when they're honest instead of theatrical. It traveled, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true, and because underneath the specifics of Marcus Bennett's story, thousands of people recognized something they had lived themselves, in smaller or larger ways. The particular exhaustion of being asked to prove you belong in spaces you have every right to occupy. Beltree PD announced, 3 weeks later, a new department-wide policy requiring dispatch verification of property and resident records before any officer could be sent to a suspicious person call at a private residence unless there was an active, corroborated emergency. Officer Dunham completed a lengthy retraining program and, to his credit, showed up at Marcus's office unannounced one afternoon in October, hat literally in hand, and apologized. Not the careful, lawyered non-apology Marcus had expected, but a real one, halting and uncomfortable and clearly costly to deliver. "I made a snap judgment," Dunham said, standing in the doorway of Marcus's office, looking younger and less certain than he had on that porch. "About you, about what you looked like, about what that meant. I've had to sit with that for weeks now. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I just needed to say it to your face instead of to a review board." Marcus studied him for a long moment. He had spent 15 years learning to read people who lied for a living, and what he saw in Dunham's face was not performance. It was the slow, painful work of a man actually confronting something in himself, which was rarer and more valuable than any scripted apology could ever be. "I appreciate you coming here," Marcus said finally. "That took more than most people have." It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, not yet. But it was a door left open instead of slammed shut, and Marcus had learned, in 2 years of raising a daughter alone, that doors left open were usually worth more than the satisfaction of slamming them. As for Colton Hargrove, the neighbor whose unverified text had started the whole chain of events, he moved out of Beltree within the year, unable to withstand the quiet, unmistakable chill that had settled over the street once everyone learned what his 4 careless words had cost a family that had done nothing but exist, peacefully, in a house they owned. In the weeks that followed, Marcus found himself thinking often about the version of that morning that almost happened, the one where Captain Ford's car hadn't turned onto Larkspur Street at that exact moment, the one where Dunham's hand had drifted from near his belt to on it, the one where a neighbor's careless assumption became a headline of an entirely different, unrecoverable kind. He thought about the families across the country who never got the version with the happy ending, who got the version where a doorstep became a courtroom of last resort with no jury, no due process, no captain arriving in the nick of time. He carried that thought into his work differently after that morning. He started volunteering 2 evenings a month at a community legal clinic 3 blocks from the courthouse, helping families who had never once been able to afford the kind of protection his badge had accidentally provided him. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because he had been given, by pure chance, a version of that morning that let him walk his daughter to school the next day. And he understood, more clearly than ever, how many people did not get that chance. Captain Ford kept her word about the review. It went all the way up, as promised, and the department published its findings publicly rather than quietly filing them away. An unusual choice that a local editorial later credited with restoring a measure of trust the department had been steadily losing for years. Officer Dunham was not fired. Marcus had specifically asked that the punishment fit the failure rather than end a young officer's career over a single, correctable lapse in judgment. But he was reassigned to 8 months of supervised patrol alongside a senior officer known throughout the department for de-escalation training, and required to complete a community immersion program that paired him, ironically, with the very neighborhood legal clinic where Marcus now volunteered. They crossed paths there twice that winter. The first time was awkward, both men unsure how to occupy the same room without the porch between them. The second time, Dunham stayed late to help an elderly tenant understand an eviction notice neither of them could quite believe was legal, and afterward, standing in the parking lot in the cold, he told Marcus something that stuck with him. "I used to think my job was reacting to what looked wrong. Dunham said. Now I think it's supposed to be understanding what's actually true. Those aren't the same thing. Took me getting it badly wrong in front of your kid to actually learn the difference. Marcus didn't say much in response. He just nodded, and they stood there a moment longer in the cold before heading to their separate cars. And it felt, for the first time, less like the aftermath of a wound and more like the slow, unglamorous machinery of somebody actually changing. Sophie's teacher called home in November, not about anything troubling, but to share something that had happened during a classroom discussion about community helpers. Sophie had raised her hand and told the class, with the particular solemnity of a 7-year-old delivering profound news, that policemen should always ask questions before they decide something is true, and that her daddy taught her that, and that her daddy was the smartest person she knew because he used his words to help people, even when it would have been easier to be angry. The teacher had laughed, gently, and told Marcus it was one of the more thoughtful things she'd heard from a student all year. Marcus had to excuse himself from his desk for a few minutes after that call. Standing at the window of his office overlooking the courthouse steps, blinking hard, thinking about Elena, thinking about how badly he wished she could have heard their daughter say that. Life on Larkspur Street mostly returned to its ordinary rhythms after that. Mornings were still chaotic. Sophie still lost socks with impossible regularity and still asked periodically whether goldfish could survive in raincoats. Marcus still hung his suit jacket by the door each night, still transformed each morning from tired father into federal prosecutor and back again. Still carried his grief for Elena quietly in the passenger seat of every ordinary day. But something had shifted too. The neighborhood, chastened, made a genuine effort. Mrs. Petrosky started leaving fresh-baked bread on his porch every other Sunday, and a young couple 2 doors down invited him and Sophie to their daughter's birthday party. And slowly, deliberately, the block began to feel less like a place he merely lived, and more like a place that had finally, truly seen him. Sophie still remembered that morning, though the fear had faded into something more like a lesson than a wound. Months later, coloring at the kitchen table while Marcus made dinner, she looked up and asked, "Daddy, if a policeman ever thinks someone did something bad, but they didn't, what should the policeman do?" Marcus set down the spoon he'd been holding and thought about it seriously. The way he tried to think about everything she asked him seriously, because he had learned that the small questions children asked were rarely actually small. He should ask questions first, Marcus said. Real ones. And he should listen to the answers, even if they're not the ones he expected. That's it. That's the whole job, really. Asking before assuming and listening before deciding. Sophie nodded, satisfied, and went back to her coloring, and Marcus stood there for a moment in his own kitchen, in his own home, on a street that had finally truly become his, and let himself feel, not vindicated exactly, but something quieter and sturdier than that. Something like peace. Because in the end, the story was never really about a badge, or a knock on a door, or even about the assumptions of a frightened neighbor. It was about a father who refused to let one terrible morning define who he was, or who his daughter would become. It was about the long, unglamorous work of showing up. For your child, for your community, for the small idea that people deserve to be seen clearly before they're judged at all. And if there is one thing this story asks of you, watching from wherever you are tonight, it is this. The next time you feel the urge to decide who someone is before you know their name, pause. Ask a question first. You might be standing on the porch of someone who has already survived more than you will ever know, quietly, with grace, one impossible morning at a time. If this story moved you even a little, make sure you're subscribed, because there are so many more stories like Marcus and Sophie's waiting for you. Stories about ordinary people carrying extraordinary weight and finding somehow the strength to keep showing up. Thank you for staying until the end. We'll see you in the next one.